Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another session in our Stretched Thin series. We've been talking about anxiety, stress, and depression and how the circumstances of this past year have really contributed to at least a possibility of being mentally unwell. Life is hard enough. The demands of everyday life are hard enough. But then you add in a global pandemic, you add in social unrest, you add in economic uncertainty, and then with this week, we obviously have a highly contentious presidential election. The stress can feel almost unbearable. Right now, it feels like we've had a sack of bricks dropped on an already overwhelmingly heavy load. And I know that many of you are feeling like you can't possibly go further at all, that your load is so heavy, that the stress is so great, that you don't know how you're possibly going to keep living your life. And if that's you today, if you're feeling stretched thin like that, I hope that this study is an encouragement to you. But maybe you're not feeling that way. Maybe you're feeling like even though things are heavy, you can still move forward, you can still press on. If that's you, that's great. My guess is that you know someone who is just barely hanging on, and you can use this study to encourage them. But also know that even if you're not at the end of your rope yet, your capacities are definitely being limited because of what you're dealing with in life. Again, the normal pressures of everyday life are hard enough, but when you add in stuff that none of us could have planned for, or really that none of us have very much control over at all, it can be overwhelming. So let's talk a little bit about stress today and how we deal with stress and how we manage stress. And the first thing that I want to say is that stress is one of those things that we're never going to get rid of altogether. Stress is really a physical or emotional response to any challenge or demand that we experience in our day-to-day lives. And that's really important in our day-to-day lives. We have challenges or demands placed upon us all the time. Just this morning, those of you who don't know my morning routine, which why would you? Krista leaves for work at about 7 o'clock, which leaves me with Sam and Eli for about an hour in the mornings before we head to my mom and dad's. Now, during that hour, I'm typically getting ready myself, and I'm getting coffee made, I'm getting all of my stuff into the car, I'm getting Sam and Eli dressed. There's a lot of downtime in that 60-minute time period. And so much of the time, Sam and Eli are just doing whatever they can. Remember, they're 5 and 2. So, of course, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old boy are going to get into whatever mischief they can. And it ends up causing a lot of stress in my life, what I would call unnecessary stress. They're getting stuff out that I'm going to have to put away. They're taking socks off. They're even taking pants off. They're getting food out of the fridge that they don't need to get out. This morning, they were getting markers out and drawing on the floor. That's stressful in and of itself. That's enough to make me feel like, oh my gosh, how am I possibly going to manage my experience of this burden? How can I possibly have a good day today in light of the stress that I experience at 7 a.m. in the morning? We have challenges and demands placed on us throughout the course of any given day. So the question isn't how do we get rid of stress? The question is how do we mitigate stress to the degree that we don't have to let it overwhelm us, that we don't have to let it become this burden that weighs us down to the point where we can't live our lives in a healthy or whole way. How do we do that? Well, I like to think of stress in terms of a water jug. And I want you to think of yourself as a water jug. We begin each day with a jug full of water, and throughout the course of the day, we're continually pouring out that water. We're pouring into our family, we're pouring into our church, we're pouring into our work. Whatever the case may be, we're pouring out into the lives of others. And even the circumstances that are beyond our control, the election being one of them. So I'm guessing that a lot of you woke up today with it being Election Tuesday, and your jug's already half empty because of the stress that has been added due to the election. A circumstance beyond your control, but nonetheless, it affects your capacity to give to others. So you wake up with a half-empty jug, you're already feeling stress, you're feeling tense when you wake up, and then throughout the course of the day, you're pouring and you're pouring and you're pouring. And eventually you reach the end of the day and your jug is empty. Well, what happens if you go into the next day and your jug hasn't been refilled the previous day? You have even less to give. You have even less energy, even less emotional capacity to interact with other people. That's really what stress is. It takes our energies and capacities away from us to the degree that we're not really able to live and serve others the way that God calls us to live and serve others. There are times in my day-to-day life where I notice that I'm pouring out and I'm pouring out and I'm pouring out, and somebody calls me and asks me to do something or asks me to commit to some kind of event or activity. And you know what I've had to learn to say? No. I've had to learn that turning down somebody or turning down something on occasion is really one of the healthiest things that I can do for myself and my overall ability to serve other people. No is a powerful thing. Boundaries can be a powerful way of mitigating our stress. But even more important than that, I found that observing a Sabbath, whether it's one full day of rest or little periods of rest throughout the week, has an incredible way of refilling me. And I want to reflect with you for the rest of this time on what it means as a person of God to practice Sabbath. Remember back to Genesis. God creates the world in 6 days. And then on the seventh day, we're told that God rested. And from that pattern of activity, from that pattern of work, and then rest, we are ourselves supposed to follow that pattern. We are ourselves supposed to have activity and supposed to work throughout the course of a week, but then we're supposed to find rest wherever we can. And the rest that the Bible teaches us about isn't just idle rest. When we learn about Sabbath from the life of the Israelites, and as we see Jesus practicing Sabbath in his own life, Sabbath isn't something that we do where we just sleep away our stress and we're couch potatoes and we're lazy and we're doing nothing at all. Maybe sometimes that's what Sabbath entails, but more importantly than that, Sabbath requires for us to intentionally engage God through the kinds of activities that fill us up. Let me rephrase that. I really like to think of Sabbath in terms of recreation. We work and we have activity. We are expending our energy and our capacities throughout the course of a given day and throughout the course of a given week. And then at some point, whether it's a full day or various periods throughout the week, we are to set aside time to be recreated. And what I mean by that is we set aside time in which we recreate. There's a connection between what I'm saying here, between the word recreate and recreation. See, when we expend our energy, we have to find ways for that energy to be refilled, for the water jug to be refilled. We need that water back in us so that we can go out into the world stress-free, or at least as stress-free as possible, to serve and to live as God intended. And one of the ways we do that is by engaging the kinds of recreational activities that fill us, that make us feel whole. For me, it's a lot of being outside, being out in nature, enjoying God's creation. I don't even have to do a whole lot. Maybe a walk, maybe a hike. It's why Chris and I went to Leadville with Sam and Eli a few weeks ago. We just knew that both of us had been dealing with a lot of stress in our work and at home. And so getting away, removing ourselves from those stresses, getting into a new environment, being in the mountains, enjoying the fresh air was enough for us to feel full again, to feel like we could fully give to the people in our lives. I also experience a lot of recreation through activities like reading and cooking. Even playing video games for me is enough to manage my stress so that I can go out the next day and pour into other people. What does that look like for you? What are the kinds of activities that help you to see God and to recognize God's peace and to recognize his love for you? And how do you fully embrace that? Do you go for walks? Do you garden? Do you have another hobby that allows you to be poured into? I want you to consider that. Life as a Christian isn't always about sacrificing our wants and our desires for others. I mean, it is that a lot of times. But don't think that just because we are called to love God and love others first, that we are to completely neglect ourselves within the process. God desires for us to care for ourselves too. The love of other, I think, entails at least a healthy love for self as well. Now, Of course, a love for self can get taken out of hand. We can do things that are unhealthy, that actually don't contribute to our wholeness or health, but actually take away from us. I'm talking about healthy practices that help us to fully recognize the image of God that's within us, and that helps us to go out into the world to fully love others. And to fully love others often requires for us to have fully loved ourselves first. How are you going to do that? If you have any thoughts about how you experience God's grace and His peace, I want you to share that in the comments. If you have a favorite hobby or activity that you feel fully helps you to be recreated, I want you to share that. And if you need tips or ideas, I'd love to set up a time for us to talk about ways for you to creatively practice Sabbath in your own lives. I've not unpack Sabbath in any kind of detail here. There's a lot more that could be said. There's a lot more that could be explained, but on a very surface level, Sabbath is a time that we set aside to experience God and to allow God to use the mundane things of life, the recreational things of life, nature, physical activity, activity with other people, time spent with other people, to fill us up so that once again, we can go out into the world to serve others without stress, or at least with as little stress as possible. I hope this is helpful to you. Next week, we will pick up with a small talk about depression. And in fact, we'll be talking about depression for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll follow up with that with some information about where we're going in the future with these video devotions. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you make it through this week with as little stress as possible. When it comes to the election, we all need to recognize that God is still in control. It doesn't matter who's president. It doesn't matter who's in charge of our country or in charge of the world, because we know that the God of grace and love is still in charge of the entire universe. Rest in that. That will bring you peace. That will bring you ease.